I'm very pleased to introduce Dimitris Charitos. I know Dimitris Charitos, it's going back how many years, Dimitris? Long time ago when we were
since the 90s, actually.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
When VR was in its infancy, and we were looking forward to technology that is going to enable us to do all the fantastic things that it does today. Dimitris is going to talk to us about teaching artistic creation within and for the metaverse. Dimitris is now a professor. I know him as a PhD student. We were still doing our PhDs when we first met, but now he is a professor at the Department of Communication and Media Studies and head of Department of Digital Arts and Cinema at National Kapodistrian University of Athens. We are very proud of this university. It's one of the best in Greece. Where he teaches human-machine communication, interactive design, digital art, virtual environment design, and visual communication. But Dimitris, apart from being an exceptional academic, he's also a practitioner. He's an active artist. He's developing audiovisual and electronic music and interactive installations and virtual environments. He's very well published. He's got above 100 publications in books and journals in distinct conferences and journals with a high impact factor. He's been participating in numerous of research projects, and I'm really looking forward to his presentations and to see where he is today. Thank you very much, Dimitris. We're all
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words. Let me just share the presentation for a minute and I will begin. Here we are. Anyway, let me just start, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor. I will speak about basically about two things. About teaching the creation of virtual environments, and about how we can research teaching in virtual environments, so to say. These two issues, of course, may coincide, yeah? And so the example I will show you on the second part of my presentation does indeed relate with the first. But let's get into the main discussion. And of course, you are all experts in VR, so why am I showing this? I'm just showing this in order to say that, okay, VR has been evolving for 55 years now, yeah? Ever since Ivan Sutherland created the first virtual reality system. And maybe one could say that the first wave of virtual reality technology started sometime at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, where still VR technology was not mature enough, it was not robust enough, and of course was not affordable at all for any of us back then. And it was very cumbersome to work research-wise and design-wise with VR. Since 2013, we saw a comeback, what I call the second wave of virtual reality technology, where the technology now is mature, the software is mature, it's affordable, it's freely downloadable for research and educational directions and applications. So although VR has matured, both in terms of software and hardware, still there's a big problem with content, yeah. And if for us that have been working with VR since the beginning of the 90s, I wonder if we don't manage to do something about creating content in VR, then probably VR is again going to fail, as it did back, in 2000, 2005, where everybody gave up on VR, or many people gave up on VR. I come from the background of architectural design, so my approach does indeed relate to the design, to the creative aspect of virtual reality. So when I started working with VR, I thought that the best thing I could do for this technology would be to invest in what I know how to do best, which is creating spaces, creating content, creating things, creating experiences, so to say. So this is mainly what I've been researching, and what I have been trying to build an approach on educating people on. Yeah. If I interpret what Alvin Grayling, like 10 days ago, spoke in Athens in an event about XR, and he mentioned this, that, you know, there's a problem with VR relating to content. Yeah. And I very much agreed with him. And if I interpret this correctly, that means that there's still a lot of work to be done on how we design, we develop, and how we produce virtual environments. That is, on how we communicate concepts and how we communicate stories with virtual environments or in virtual environments. Let me stress the word produce, because production is not development. Or if I want to say this correctly, there is traditional methodologies that we have been following since the 90s on how to design, develop, implement, and evaluate virtual environments. And all these methodologies basically relate to human-computer interaction methodologies, or mostly, but many of them do not actually cater, do not actually support properly the production aspect that we need to, in VR. And why do we need that? Because VR is a medium. It's not just a human-computer interface. And being a medium, you need to create a content for it, and content needs production. So if I go for a minute or two briefly into this discussion about the communicational aspect of VR, there's a big discussion since the 90s about it. Several important social scientists have worked on investigating what is VR. So some key points here. VR has been portrayed as a communication medium by Stoyer. Bricken has discussed about VR and about its inclusive relationship between the participant and the virtual environment, where the experience of the immersive environment with the user constitutes communication. And of course, Schroeder suggested that the very notion of communication implies some sort of exchange of messages between two or more people. And that happens when we have multi-user VR. So he basically suggested that we could define single-user VR as an information technology rather than a communication technology. But then Riva has suggested that single-user VR could also be considered a communication interface. Yeah, and Bioka and Levy and Bioka and Delaney discussed again very well, and that their papers are very, very useful in how we understand VR as a communications interface. So in other words, VR is a human-computer interface to all kinds of media. So we can embed and compose and synthesize within the context of a space, of a series of spaces, of a spatial composition. We can embed and compose all sorts of media. And so we could consider VR as an intrinsically spatial type of a communication interface. So that I would close the parenthesis here because I wanted to stress the nature of VR as a medium, the mediatic nature of VR. And so we have been working for a while now from the perspective of educating our students how to create virtual environments. And because we've been doing that in a department of communication and media studies, at a postgraduate level, that is. We have invested a lot on stressing the parts of the creation of a virtual environment that are specifically relating to its mediatic nature. So we have been working for a few years, and we have been trying to extend the traditional models. So this is a model we have been building for a while on traditional models and trying to extend them. And what I want to stress here, of course, we know that the traditional approaches to analysis that may relate to understanding our users, understanding the context, the social, the cultural context, the technological context. But of course, when you're talking about creators, artists, and so forth, one thing that you would start from also is the objectives of the creators, the expression, the expressive objectives of the creators. But we have been investing a lot on the design aspect of this process. I think this is where we can offer more. So we have been extending the design aspect of this process towards what we can do to create narratives, nonlinear narratives, through creating nonlinear scenario, nonlinear storyboards, and then on how we can communicate meaning through two-dimensional content within or outside the environment on the interface. Of course, there's audiovisual content, video that can be embedded. This is also a part of it. And interaction, two-dimensional and three-dimensional interaction. And three-dimensional content, of course, is another very important direction. How do we create spaces for virtual environments? This is one of my personal main areas of research. I will explain about it a bit later. And of course, relating to the interface is all the design of the interaction properties and the design of the audio aspects of the environment. Of course, all this starts from the back end of the whole thing, that is the system architecture, the information architecture, and then we do indeed use all the traditional methods that we use for human-computer interfaces. So our work, our educational work, has been focusing a lot on extending the traditional approaches towards these directions that I just mentioned, the creative aspects of virtual environments in these areas. These do indeed have bridges on the development of these environments. And with the development, we understand that lies the production of this content, of course. So you do write the code, to support the interaction, but you also have to complete and produce all the forms of content that have to be embedded in this environment, so to say. So things are not that difficult, or they're probably a bit more straightforward when we do simulate reality in a virtual environment experience. So there, we need to simulate physical environments in a more convincing manner as possible. And we don't need to imagine new forms or visual or auditory or whatever in order to compose these environments. Well, now you can see that yes, slide, yeah?
Thank you very much.
That's better. Sorry about that. Still, the fonts are tiny, yeah? Can you see anything? Well, I'll send it to you anyway, so don't worry.
That's better. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. So, as I said, that you know, when we need to design a simulation, things are more straightforward, and sometimes we need to embed a cinematic content in the simulation. Again, things are quite straightforward. This is a production from our Department of Digital Arts and Cinema, and in collaboration with Plesio for creating a cinematic VR application for autistic children. But what happens when we don't need to imitate the real world? We don't need to imitate our physical surroundings, but we want to create something that we have imagined and does not resemble anything in the physical world. Well, things are a bit more difficult then, yeah. And I think our research, our work lies there mostly, because we need to create compositions of novel objects, of multisensory forms, in order to accommodate human activities. And these do not necessarily resemble anything in the physical world, or they don't resemble everything in the physical world. So, and I think that's very important that's a very important direction to research, because this is one of the most important potentials of VR as a medium. This potential of allowing us to visualize, to make perceptible things that we imagine. You know, I think before that there was no other medium rather than cinema that allowed us to do that. But cinema is not interactive. Cinema is not navigable or nor immersive. So VR is probably the first medium that does let our senses communicate with a representation. And in this representation, somebody may have created something that they have imagined, but that doesn't exist. So I think this is very important, particularly for the creative arts, particularly for all the creative, let's say, the fine arts or the applied arts, for that matter. And I think that this is also a very interesting direction to research in relation to whatever we create in VR. So I'll speak briefly about some directions in this research that are basically focusing on these aspects that I just talked about. So designing nonlinear scenario, designing nonlinear narratives, nonlinear content, and also designing the spaces and the spatial elements in virtual environments. And also a very important issue is the aesthetics of this medium, the aesthetics of virtual environments, particularly following the recent approaches on the aesthetics of 3D graphics. So, oh, that's great. Just I'm restarting a 70 meg PowerPoint. That's why it takes some time. So I don't just crashed on me. Anyway, so because there's a big gap now in my presentation, I can start talking a little bit about the main thing that I've been researching, which is the creation of spaces in VR. I think one of the issues that needed to be researched was the actual nature, the intrinsic nature of spaces in VR, when you don't need to imitate physical reality, then you have to start understanding, you know, what are the characteristics of these spaces, the intrinsic characteristics of these spaces. And let me quickly share this again with you. And yes, I'll go directly to this slide, to the issue of the spatial characteristics of VR. And so one main characteristic is that space in VR is non-continuous, non-contiguous too. You can teleport from anywhere to anywhere. Also that the principles of real space could be violated when we need to do that. Space could be also multidimensional. We don't have physical constraints in VR, and we don't have necessarily scale consistency. And what is also very important, something that we also learn from the theories of the phenomenology of space, is that our sense of space very much relates to our sense of our body. Yeah, so whatever body we have and how we are represented in a space very much relates to the sense of space that we experience. So I've been doing several experiments since the 90s, and I have been trying to work on certain taxonomies of space and certain elements of space in VR. So have kind of resulted in a series of types of spaces that we can use in virtual environments. So a kind of a type of space is a place, a path, an intersection, and a domain. So this is a place, this is somewhere where we can do organize certain activities. Paths are linear kinds of spaces, mainly supporting navigation. Intersections are kind of spaces where paths do meet. And domains are larger compositions of spaces. And of course, there's elements of space which allow for the establishment of these spaces by arranging them within any compositions. And these could be categorized in landmarks, boundaries, thresholds, and signs. Landmarks are kinds of objects that can be easily identified. Boundaries are the kinds of objects that we use to bound spaces. Thresholds are kind of transitional spaces that we go through in order to get from here to there. And signs are elements of space that primarily carry meaning, in order to communicate it. I don't want to get too much into detail. These are very old compositions and designs, but I have conducted a series of experiments to understand the behavior of humans, of single users, basically, at that point, on the use of these kinds of spaces. And so in order to understand how we navigate it, how we interact with these types of spaces, and in order to learn from these experiments on how to compose these spaces. These experiments have continued with a great collaboration with my colleague Haris Rizopoulos, who has continued to work on elements and kinds of spaces like the ones you see here. And again, he has studied the navigational and interactional behavior within kinds of spaces. And we have created several applications with that actually follow these results, these experimental results, one of them being the virtual museum project back in 2000 that we did for the National Kapodistria University of Athens. So you see here that this is not a simulation of a museum. This is a composition of a set of spaces following these concepts that I just described, and trying to see how much we can get away from the realistic navigational behavior of the physical world. And what does this mean for creating spaces around this behavior to sort of envelop this behavior? So these are the examples from the virtual museum. And these are some more experimental virtual environments that I have created quite a few years ago. And also, we have been experimenting with how we can interact with these environments and these compositions in a non-immersive context, like how we can create more embodied forms of interaction, and with projection-based, simple projection-based environments like the ones here, or with large projection spaces like the ones here. That's a project we did back in 2015, and it involved working on an interactive, on a virtual environment projected on a full dome at the SAT in Montreal, where we did create support of 3 to 5 users with different elements of this virtual environment. Again, here you see a non-realistic representation, a representation of a set of spaces and objects that doesn't resemble anything from the real world. Now, another issue that I want to touch upon, if you allow me, that I need to go back from the composition of spaces to something else that I discussed, and that's so when we design, apart from the design of spaces, of course we do follow hierarchical task analysis depending on what exactly we want to do, or we do try to compose scenario, and we do start from text, but then we, and now I'm referring to the way we teach these design classes, particularly at the postgraduate course we have on the design of virtual environments at the Department of Communication. So we focus a lot on how we can create stories, how we can write scenario which do have a nonlinear structure. So this is a representation of a nonlinear scenario. You know, from a nonlinear scenario, you can transform, you can move up to nonlinear storyboards, where you do have storyboarding, but you do start to create connections between scenes that may allow for nonlinear structures. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a very important issue of research that we're very interested and keen on working currently is the aesthetics of VR. So if we follow on the work of very, very important new artists like Claudia Hart, Mike Pelletier, and others, Weirdcore, and others that work with experimenting with the nature of 3D graphics, totally away from non-realistic representations. And of course, looking back at very important experimental work from Shar Davis and Marcos Novak. Here's some experiments from one of my students, Dimitris Milonas, who worked on the types of rendering with Unity and exact spatial and formal representations in virtual environments. That was in his master's dissertation. So when we teach our communication students that in this master's course, we do accept not only communication and media students, but the students that come to us for learning how to create virtual environments come from very different perspectives, very different backgrounds. Very few of them are IT people, are information scientists. Most of them could be, you know, historians, literature studies, humanities, philosophy, social workers, psychologists, yeah? And we think this is very, very important. We try to maintain this because we very much believe that these people have to learn how to design and develop and produce VR. And I'm stressing that because when they learn the nuts and bolts of how to create virtual environments, they do realize the potential of the medium. And they bring new approaches into the medium, and I think we need that very much. And of course, taking into account the best of the students, the best examples of the students, I believe that they do indeed bring new approaches, and we learn a lot from them, from these different perspectives, when they enter the actual process of developing these virtual environments, which means that they learn how to do it. They're not like consultants telling us what to do and develop. They develop the virtual environments. And also one thing we have been conducting for some time now is that we have been working we have been using multi-user virtual environments in order to conduct psychological or social small-scale experiments with the students. So psychologists or social psychologists, students of communication that work with us, conduct small-scale social experiments in virtual environments in terms of their dissertations or their projects. And we have been seeing some very interesting results in that direction too. So for the last part of my presentation, let me go to the second aspect of what I wanted to discuss about. What happens when you want to teach art making in VR? We have been drafted into this by the pandemic, I have to be honest. So, you know, when working with my students at the Department of Digital Arts and Cinema, I had this course on creating video installations or installations in physical space. And we were in the pandemic era, so we had to find a clever way to actually teach them how to create form, three-dimensional form, audiovisual elements in three-dimensional form, but we had to do it through WebEx or Zoom. Well, it can't be done. I'm sorry, we can't do it. So we organized this class on a whole semester. We organized this in a multi-user virtual environment. And it was quite successful, I believe. So we did change the subject a bit. So the subject became composing in virtual environments, composing an artistic composition in virtual environments. But for us, for the scientists, designers teaching them, it was also an experiment on learning how this can be done in a virtual reality context. This is not something new. Obviously, many people, many colleagues have conducted this before. I'm just telling you our own experience from that. And so we did use the WebEx context for providing better auditory communication, because the auditory communication through the virtual environment was not that good. We did use OpenSim as a platform for multi-user VR, basically because it's not proprietary. It's something we could install in our servers, and we thought we were very, very cautious with the fact that the creations of our students would lie on our server and not on some company's server. And we're very careful with these issues relating to the content that the students create. So we used OpenSim. Of course, it's not a state-of-the-art platform. We know that, but it did work properly. We created a setup like the one you see here. We gave students areas to work in, and students created a series of projects with a certain artistic concept. They created three-dimensional compositions in 3D modeling software like Blender, and then they imported this into OpenSim, where we had big difficulties because of incompatibilities. So they created compositions of several elements. So they told stories, they touched upon issues that they were interested in commenting and so forth. Here's some of the examples of what they did. These were actually second-year students 2 years ago. And you can let me share this full screen. It's a bit better now, isn't it? Yeah. Just slowly showing you some of the examples of these works. We had 32 students. They mostly used OpenSimulator. And we did conduct a survey, an online survey, to analyze the result of this. So we had, I guess I won't get into detail on into the study because there's not much time for that. But we were interested in understanding the motivation, the feelings, and the satisfaction that they had or they didn't have because of this experience. And so we focused on the educational impact in relation to this particular design direction and how they experienced the whole thing. And also we got to discuss with the teachers to get their views too. So we thought that this proved to be an efficient way of teaching this particular class. We thought that it was quite productive to combine the 3D context with the teleconferencing platform so that we could cover the functional sort of audio communication too, coming from the teleconferencing platform. And we thought that in general, the students coped quite well with this manner of teaching. Qualitative results, there was, in general, the majority of students preferred working with the open simulator rather than just with a WebEx platform. Some of them didn't cope to do that. That's the comparison, but most of them actually did. Regarding the aspects that facilitated, we thought that facilitated the learning process, well, I guess the teaching staff was quite supportive. There was a lot of extra practical training in teaching them all the use of the tools. And they did indeed feel a sense of presence in their projects, actually, in their presentation of their projects. We had problems, as I mentioned earlier. There's still incompatibilities basically between the 3D modeling software and the particular platform that we used. There are problems in using Open Simulator. It's an open platform, and that means that it does have problems because the support is not there. Of course, we had technical or connectivity issues during the pandemic, and you know, learning time was not enough. It was quite a complex subject to work on, I'd say. So also, in terms of collaboration, I think they did find that this element of synchronous collaboration when we coexisted in this environment satisfactory. We did attempt to work with additional communication channels like via Discord or Messenger and so forth. And well, in terms of how they learned new skills or they didn't, we didn't get that much of a positive result. I don't think they were very confident. I think it was all a bit too much for them because all this happened in a period of 3 months. Yeah. So, but, you know, still, I think that the overall result was quite positive. So I think I will stop here and maybe take a few questions if you want.
Thank you, Dimitris. That would be nice. I think we've seen, you know, you throw loads of content to us to you know, to give us food for thought for questions.
Sorry for the non-linear character of the presentation.
Don't worry,
yeah.
you're an artist.
This all started
so
when I had the malfunction. Yeah, but there you go. So I'll be very happy to respond to questions.
So
can I just give a feedback or just a comment?
Please,
first
yes.
of all, I would love to be hanging out with you. I think it's so cool what you've done, and you know, incorporated all this learning and wanting to impart that with your students. And it's like, oh, I only wish to be one of your students. I think it's so cool what you've done. And I love the fact of you know, the interdisciplinary collaboration, because I think that's what I see the power in, is when all of the different disciplines come together and what we can learn from each other, because everyone's coming from a different lens, a different perspective. So social psychology, you know, that's a totally different lens to, you know, someone from IT or from, you know, even architecture or whatever. So I love the collaboration. I think it's so very cool. And I love also that your presentation was nonlinear. I think it only just enhanced the whole part of, you know, I don't know. I wish we were all cut on nonlinear when it comes to our presentations. Anyways, And the other thing I also really appreciated, and what is so cool about VR is, like, why do we want to create the same? We are in boxes already, you know, we're in these square linear boxes. Why aren't we creating these really amazing worlds that, you know, don't exist, and that that this medium has the capacity to actually possibly take what's in our minds and our imaginations and create them, you know? Anyways, I just loved your presentation. I would love to hang out with you. I really appreciate that you shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words. Thank you. I do believe I do believe very much in the creative potential of VR. I think it gives us a huge expressive abilities. And honestly, that's why I got into this medium. You know, when I realized back in 1992, I was doing my dissertation on architectural representations with computing. Yeah, I was studying CAD back then. Yeah, and you know, that was the time of multimedia, the beginnings of multimedia and VR. And then I realized there was interactive video, but then there was VR. So these were two forms of creating representations of spaces. And then I realized that virtual environments could be a platform where you could actually embed all mediatic forms in order to create more holistic representations, yeah, of anything you could imagine. So that's why I believe very much in the creative potential of VR. So I hope we can get our students to do much better things that we ever thought of in the future. Thank you.
Are there any other questions before I start firing? Right.
If
First
you
of all,
don't have questions, and if I have another 5 minutes, I could show you a short video or a part of a video if you want.
Please do so. I have questions. Maybe I can throw the questions.
Oh, please. Yes,
and
yes.
we can discuss while you're also showing us the video. And I don't know if there is audio in the video, maybe you can mute it so we can see while we're discussing.
Let's go for the questions.
Yeah, first of all, I'm going to quote you for the VR is a medium, and for this you need content, and for this you need production. I think I'll use that in many presentations that I'm going to do from now on. You talked about the different elements that we need to consider when we are creating spaces, and I was wondering, is there a kind of prioritization in the importance of the different elements of these spaces, and an effect into UX and into learning? So if I want to take from you, if I want to learn something from you in how to create the environments and how to create the content for these environments in the learning context, are there certain elements that they have more validity than others?
I think if it helps, I think an important question is how much do we want to get away from physical environments? Yeah, if we need to. Yeah, that's important, because we may want to teach people about an activity or something within a context that this activity may happen. Yeah. But if we are, if we do not need to do that, we don't need to simulate, of course, in that case, I mean, then we can start well, let me rephrase what I'm trying to say. The elements of space and the elements and the spatial elements that compose that delimit spaces in order to compose these spaces give us, let's say, information about how we can structure a space. I think what we can do is that we can start by creating scenario, non-linear scenario about stories we want to say or about activities we want to organize. And usually the maps or the representations of this scenario or these activities may give us hints about how the spaces that we want to create in order to position, in order to house these activities, could be structured. I've seen quite a few times when working with my students, I've seen this thing happen, that we create non-linear structures of scenario, of an activity or of a story we want to say. And these structures actually give us hints about the spaces we need to put these stories in, so to say. Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it does, but it sounds a bit ad hoc. It does, but it sounds a bit ad hoc. And I'm just wondering if there is if there are sort of more strict guidelines to be followed.
It's very difficult to speak about guidelines. I think at this stage, I think there's a lot of research that needs to be conducted in that direction, and for me, it's very difficult to give guidelines, because I think whenever we start with such an application or an environment, we always start from scratch. We start from scratch. We conduct a very careful analysis of what we have, who we're going to do this for, what is that we want to do, what is the context within which this will function. We need to invest some work on that all the time before we even think about what we're going to compose. And this is something we always do with the students. I mean, we never start a project without conducting a very careful analysis. And then we start thinking about the scenario and the potential space where this scenario is going to evolve, is going to materialize. But there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. I think it's very early to speak about guidelines, because it's very difficult to say that there's solutions like that are appropriate for many cases of this. That's the problem.
Dimitri, I'm going to read some questions that they are coming in the chat.
Oh, that's great. I see them. And
it says, you said most people are not from IT background. What skills are most needed to be able to learn how to create VR? What kind of background does one need to enter the field is one question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say that most of our students in this master's course are not from IT background, not because we don't want them. We would love to have them, but they just don't come because we're a Department of Communication and Media Studies. So it's not something we select, but it happens. So I think VR is a subject that needs students or researchers from every background. What I'm trying to stress is that there's a lot of need from disciplines which are not IT oriented, and not HCI related. Yeah, we need other people that relate to how we create any kind of content, how we create meaningful representations, how we tell stories, how we conduct social or psychological analysis of any situation. I'm just trying to stress that we need these people in the picture too. I think definitely we need people that have studied IT for sure. Yeah, we couldn't do it without them.
But
there is
oh, sorry. I just want to interrupt just in terms of, so what are the skills? Like, what are the, I think what Susan's saying, and I'm interested in this as well, is what are the, I guess, preliminary skills, the preliminary VR skills that one needs to learn in order to, and you're using Unity and Blender as well? Like that's,
yeah. Basically, in our master's course, we start with 0 skills relating to IT. And we teach 3D modeling, we teach Unity, we teach methodologies, we teach design approaches, and research methodologies. And then we conduct the design and development and evaluation of the project. That's how we work. It's a master's course, so these people have already a bachelor's degree or a diploma, and whatever background they come from, if they study enough, they can be very successful. So we had already people from social science, psychology, historians, philosophers that have been doing great projects. Yeah. They're not very advanced as far as the development aspect is, but it's not very important. The way they create the stories and they develop them and they produce them, it tells us a lot. So I don't see a limitation to, I would say, from any background, and that's important. Yeah.
Sorry, emerged to ask, and I'm worried the time is passing. This open simulator that you've been using, I understand that you've been using it for creation, for presentation, and for assessment. It's a tool that you used for co-creation. How all this correlates to the process?
Yeah. Well, Open Simulator has creative tools, not very advanced, but so you can use 3D models and elements, but at the end you position them in Open Simulator. Open Simulator is a multi-user VR platform, but it has a certain functionality, not as good as Unity, for instance, but you can actually put together the worlds, so to say, and the elements, yeah? And quite frankly, because the compatibility between the 3D modeling tool and the platform, this platform was not that good, then we ended up doing a lot of the content in Open Simulator. It's not very advanced. It's actually, it's exactly the engine that Second Life was, so it's old school, but it's quite functional, and it's open, yeah? So we could keep the whole thing on our own server.
My question is how this correlates to the process, to what you started your conversation talking about the production process. So how with the product, like, with a tool like this production process is enabled, it's supported. Is it supported effectively?
Yes. With many limitations, but basically this is the environment where students went in to do the work, to put together their compositions, and then we all went in there to see the compositions. So it's like if we were in physical space, but we were in virtual space. So it worked like that. So it supported the development for the students. They could all go in there and collaborate remotely to do the compositions. And then we met and we all went in there to actually discuss about the result. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, for your presentation. I'm worried that it's past 1 minute, not that much, but we are in the whole hour and we keep you here. And I'm going to close here with one of the comments again in the chat that it says, with so many of us interested in learning more, is there any possibility you will be teaching any of your courses online in the future, or even more, or some special session here in iLRN soon?
I would love to. Let's
discuss about that. We'd love to see you, and yes, let's discuss about that. It's a very nice idea. It hasn't been proposed by me. It's been proposed by people being in your session, which is even better, which shows that what we're looking for, and it shows also that it was very good for us that we brought in, and you were a fantastic contribution to our conference. Dimitris, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's been in this session. Thank you for your enthusiasm.
Thank you for your kind words, and I was so happy to see you all. Cheers.
Indeed. Bye. Thank you.